and welcome back, because you were all waiting for this to happen. This series is going to be about fan fiction writing. Obviously, I've stated that before. But before we get into the nuts and bolts of writing, both profic and fan fiction, plus the stuff unique to fan fiction, we should probably know what fan fiction is. Kind of helpful. Now I want you all to notice I put on makeup. My lips are bright. I did that for you. Thank me later. So what is fan fiction? Fan fiction is derivative and transformative fiction based on an already existing source. We call it canon. This term actually goes back to the 1800s when people were writing Sherlock Holmes fan fiction. Legally published, none of it written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, thus fan fiction. Some fan fiction, as I just said, is pro-published, Sherlock Holmes. There's Jane Austen fan fiction, if you can believe that. Other examples of published fan fiction in the more recent times are the extended universe Star Wars novels, Star Trek novels, etc., etc. You see where this is going. Lots of series have ongoing book series to supplement the canon of the show, of the movie, of whatever the original source is. These are very rarely written by the original show's creators. Buffy novels, for example, are not written by Joss Whedon. The extended universe Star Wars novels are not written by George Lucas. Thus, they are fan fiction. And that is literally all fan fiction is. Some other examples you might not think of is Wicked. It is a Wizard of Oz fan fiction, legally published, legally licensed, and extremely popular, but still fan fiction. My favorite fan fiction that's been legally published is a play called Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. It's a play that is fan fiction to the play Hamlet by William Shakespeare. If you haven't read this play or seen the movie with Gary Oldman, I suggest you go do that now because it's fucking hilarious. Another piece of fan fiction you might not think of as fan fiction is the 2004 movie I, Robot starring Will Smith. This movie was based on a series of short stories under an anthology titled I, Robot by Isaac Asimov. This movie is not actually a story written by Asimov, but it is set within his world. Thus, fan fiction. One thing that's questionable as fan fiction is some modernizations, usually of Shakespeare plays going back to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. The Leonardo DiCaprio version of Romeo and Juliet, even though the story and dialogue all stayed the exact same, the setting was different. Instead of swords, there were guns. Instead of ancient Vienna or wherever the original story was set, I'm sorry, I failed my English class on Romeo and Juliet. Instead of wherever it was, it's based in LA. If I remember right, I've only seen the movie once. That could be considered fan fiction by some standards, by other standards not so much. Some examples of authors that have written fan fiction are Diane Duane, who's responsible for the Young Wizards Chronicles. She started writing Star Trek novels. Another one that people don't really realize is a fanfic author is J. Michael Straczynski, the guy who invented Babylon 5. He had been writing for Spider-Man for Marvel for quite some time before he created Babylon 5. Since Spider-Man is not his original character, even though he was hired by the company that owned the copyrights to write for him, he was technically writing fan fiction. Two other names you might know in fan fiction are E.L. James and Cassandra Clare. Modern fan fiction is considered to have started in the mid-1960s during the height of the popularity of the original Star Trek series. Fan fiction was first published in something called fanzines, which I'm not going to go into because I don't understand exactly what they are and how legal they are. But this is where we get some of our modern terminology such as Mary Sue and slash, which I will get into as we go along. Fanfiction continued to be written in fanzines, spreading out to other fandoms, meaning other canon sources. It wasn't just Star Trek anymore. But fanfiction really took off with the advent of the internet. There is one estimate that 1/3 of all content regarding books on the internet is fanfiction. How true this is, I don't know. I would not be surprised. Online fanfiction started with Usenet email listings and slowly moved on to fanfiction archives, eventually coming to a site called fanfiction.net, which was launched in 1998. As an aside, I joined 2 years later and somehow still managed to capture the name unoriginality. 2 years and no one had thought of this as a clever nickname. I am sorely disappointed. An interesting note, since I will be talking about Eastern animation as a source of fandom, is that doujinshi, while they had started in the late 1800s, really took off around the same time as the Star Trek fanzines. Doujinshi being fan comics and illustrated stories, essentially visual fan fiction. Two notable fan fictions that became published pieces include the 50 Shades of Grey trilogy written by E.L. James. It was originally a fan fiction called Master of the Universe, a Twilight fan fiction featuring Edward Cullen and Bella Swan. You can see where Christian Grey and Anastasia Steele get their charming personalities. There was also a fanfic of One Direction called After that in 2013 received a book and movie contract. I've never read this and I've never heard anything coming from it, but that's what Wikipedia tells me. We'll trust it. Clarified fanfic is specifically fan fiction about real life people who are in bands. It's a little skeevy to me. It's a form of RPF, which means real person fiction. Two of the terms I've mentioned so far is slash and I believe Mary Sue. If I didn't, we'll pretend I did. Mary Sue, which is now known in professional publishing circles, is an idealized author self-insert that is usually not flatteringly called Mary Sue. Mary Sue refers to characters that were meant to make fun of a trope going on in the Star Trek fanzine fandom, where an original character, the minor crew member, always female, who saves either Captain Kirk or Mr. Spock and in exchange receives a sexual relationship. Now, the term is not so flattering. If someone calls your character Mary Sue, you might need to reevaluate your character. Another term that I mentioned is slash, which also originates with the Star Trek fanzine fandom. Specifically, slash comes from the phrase Kirk/Spock. Slash stands for a homosexual relationship, almost always a male-male relationship. Following from that is the word fem/, meaning a lesbian relationship. There's also het. Wikipedia mentions something called friendshipping as a form of shipping, which means to support a couple or a polyamorous group in a relationship. Friendshipping is supposed to be about platonic relationships. I have never heard this term. I have only ever heard the term gen. I'm not sure where that term came from either, but it's the term I know. So in the future, if I talk about fics that are specifically focused on platonic relationships, I will be referring to them as gen fics, not friendshipping. That word sounds ridiculous to me. Among other fanfiction terms that will come up, besides the dreaded slash and Mary Sue, will be things like fluff/WAF, warm and fuzzy feelings. Another form that I will devote an entire video to eventually is AU, also known as alternate universe. There's also something called dark fic, which is essentially a fic that has very dark themes and is usually darker than the original canon. There's also angst, which is basically a vignette focusing on a character doing nothing but whining to themselves. There's also hurt comfort, which is a fic type that a lot of people dislike and a lot of people still write. It's a fic where something traumatic happens to one character for the sole sake of throwing them into another character's arms for comfort. This is usually done to force a relationship, or at least a one-time sexy time stand, but it's almost always terrible. Even though fanfiction is a transformative and derivative work and therefore theoretically covered under fair use, there is precedent that it is both fair use and illegal. It depends on what court case you look at. 2009, a United States District Court judge named Deborah A. Batts banned publication in the U.S. of a Swedish novel about a 76-year-old Holden Caulfield from Catcher in the Rye. This case can be seen as making fan fiction illegal. The judge's exact words were, To the extent defendants contend that 60 years in the character of Mr. C direct parodied comment or criticism at Catcher or Holden Caulfield as opposed to Salinger himself, the court finds such contentions to be post hoc rationalizations employed through vague generalizations about the alleged naivety of the original rather than reasonably perceivable parody. I think she's a bitch, but that's just me. There's been a long history between copyright holders and fanfiction authors. Sometimes it's favorable, sometimes it's not. In 1981, for example, Lucasfilms sent letters to various fanzines reasserting their copyright holding and explicitly banning pornographic content in these fanzines. Presumably, the other content could continue to fly under its radar. One example of a fanfiction I wouldn't even consider a fan fiction, but it set precedent for the possible legality of it, was the Harry Potter lexicon. The Harry Potter lexicon was basically an encyclopedia of all things Harry Potter. It wasn't even fiction. It was an encyclopedia. This was published, and it was the one time that J.K. Rowling has ever sued a fan for fan content for violating her copyright. There was no difference between the lexicon and her actual content, therefore she did not consider it covered as fan fiction and was infringing on her copyright, especially since the lexicon was making money off it. Oddly, the judges actually ruled in favor of the authors of the lexicon, which really confuses me because, again, the lexicon was not fan fiction. It was an encyclopedia. That's it. But this does set precedent that fan fiction may be considered legal, possibly even publishable, but I think that might be pushing it. There are several copyright holders, authors that actually encourage or at least enjoy fan fiction. J.K. Rowling is very well known as being in favor of fan fiction of her works, except the aforementioned lexicon, which again was not fan fiction. Stephanie Meyer of Twilight fame also gives blessings to fanfiction and in fact links to various Twilight fanfiction archives on her website. I will be linking that below. Orson Scott Card is an author that's worth noting because when he first heard of fanfiction, he thought it was the equivalent of someone coming into his house and throwing a party against his will. He later recanted that sentiment, stating that he realized that each fanfiction was a free ad for his original works, and he would be crazy to turn that down. There are several copyright holders that are against fanfiction. Anne Rice is very notable as notoriously against fanfiction. Another one that's been against fanfiction all her life was Anne McCaffrey. When she died and her son took over the copyright for her stuff, he changed that in fanfiction regarding McCaffrey's work is now considered legal. This might surprise you, but George R.R. Martin of Game of Thrones fame thinks that fanfiction is intellectually illegal and lazy. I think he can go fuck himself. Sharon Lee and Steve Miller are also against fanfiction and state that the reason for this is because nobody is going to get their characters right. Elitist pricks. Next time I'm going to be getting into some other terms specific to fan fiction. I'm sorry, we're not getting down to the writing stuff just yet. I need to discuss some more terms, definitions. Most notably, I need to do a video on what fandom is, which is where fan fiction finds its home. Without fandom, there's no fan fiction. Fan fiction, however, drives fandom, and I'll get more into that in the next video. Like I said, I will also be doing a video devoted to alternate universes. And I will also be advertising my own fanfiction in that video because that's what I'm working on now, is a giant alternate universe that makes me want to kill myself. So with that,